Good afternoon, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Nobody here.
Yeah, well, all the important people are here right now.
That's right. I'm glad you realize that. We're gonna have to leave at 3, so I'm gonna
Okay.
sit on the side.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Folks can come and go as you please. I appreciate you telling me.
Yeah. No, I hate this, I'm leaving after.
Yeah. I'm out of here.
What's your name?
My name is Andre.
Andre and Angela.
Angela.
Nice to meet you. Where is everybody?
Folks are coming. People usually kind of do just in time and stuff, so, it's 10 tails, so they'll get here 1 after, 2 after.
Okay.
So what organization are you with?
I'm actually, here in Minnesota, from, I moved here, and I just recently gotten, studying out with, Spring Break Awards, and, that's why we've been Arts Council, so I'm just going to, committees, so I can support the culture, it doesn't happen in my department.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm not with, if that's okay with you.
Oh, that was fun. I'm glad you're here.
So far, I'm not with an organization, so far,
Okay, cool.
but, what you will see.
Yeah, and those are great places to live. In this particular city, and these cities, it's tough. All of my, when I first moved to this, all of my friends were transplants from other places. And it took a long time to get so-called Minnesota friends. So we formed our own packs, and my thing was I used the city pages and went to like dance clubs or
Right, see, at my age, that kind of thing doesn't, that's
right, no,
Right.
I'm saying your approach is the right one to take.
Yeah.
Find those watering holes where there are people like you who have your similar likes and stuff. You get together and
And I am, I'm finding them, there's things like the arts and art world and these people there and I'm a photographer,
well,
so.
the answer is what is your art?
Yeah, I was trained as a costume designer and working in film and theater and
No, sit down.
I feel like it's about 45 and then I went south and then I'm told, well, you have to go back to the world, so I made it right. It's a fantastic place.
Hello, how are you?
I'm from the beginning.
Yeah, the other got to be way too dumb. For 18 hours a day, 7 days a week.
What part of it?
All of it, from the design to the running the show, to people calling me with 3 o'clock in the morning, doing it on computers. Okay, yeah, I can do that, why, super, I'm sure. I did.
Yeah, and maybe we'll talk about it too. So I was doing improv, and one of the things that for me, I got out of improv because of the demand of person.
The demand of, what was that?
So
I'm just all about the stripes going, I know what's.
I'm gonna get ready for the game.
yeah.
Hi.
Yes. I thought I was.
So all of a sudden,
Okay, I might just do that. Yeah.
I wanted to connect to the Apple TV because it's on, right?
Yeah.
I'm able to connect to Office.
Any passwords or anything? Or, I don't know about that. I'm not. I can get you our uploading password.
Oh.
Hi, how are you? Good.
This is why it's important to be smarter than the machines. Yeah. No, it seems as though every time I go to do a presentation, PowerPoint or something is wonky the day or the time.
There's always a
So,
bump.
what's that?
There's always a bump.
There's always some kind of bump. And so what I've done is I make sure that I have a different way to do that. So in the event, yeah, I just looked it up. It said it had to be on the same network.
Oh, so we do have to sign in as Emma on Apple? Is that what that means?
No, I think it just means to connect to
Our Wi-Fi.
the Wi-Fi.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Keep going down and we, yeah. Nope, that's not it. Next one down. And right. That one. And password is creative, but the E's are please.
It's better.
I just thought it was random letters. It's still creative. Oh, yeah.
Got it.
Got it?
Did I just turn something on? I think I did. I was
Could have
like,
been a dramatic day.
yeah, I'm like, whoa, I need some smoke and lights.
That's pretty.
Let's go find her. So,
Did it work? No.
that's okay. I got this everything going, so we're good.
I'm sure some other people will check in because I know there's a couple on the list that work for me for sure. But if you haven't been here lately or ever, our restrooms are back out on Everett Hallway to the right and then to the right again. You find the men's room and the women's room back in the corner there. We have coffee now. There's sparkling beverages and sodas in the fridge here. Help yourself whenever you need a little pick me up as you go in this afternoon. And then snacks there too, to help you get through the afternoon. Well, welcome to the I'm Dr. Whitehead. I get to attend all of these trainings, and I'm program director here at MRAC. I'm currently working on booking the rest of the year in trainings, and I can tell you we have some good stuff coming up. So be on the lookout for those. We'll have between 3 and 5 different trainings every month on a variety of topics. So Teresa, you can get your schedule also. You're like A+, you come to all this stuff lately. That's great. Yeah, thanks. I also am really welcome if you're like, I really want to learn about this, or I really need more information in this regard, or this was a really great training, let's go further with that. That kind of feedback really helps, and I can then go from there. I sometimes send out evaluations, and I sometimes don't, because I know we all get tired of filling out surveys, but I also hope that we have an open dialogue and you can share what's helpful and what would be really good to check out, or people you come across too. So we had Andre here a couple weeks ago, back again, different topic. We're going to dive in today on cultural competence 2.0. It's been really good for me to keep practicing spelling competence.
Yes.
Like I don't know why I want an A in there somewhere and it doesn't belong, and so thank you for that. But beyond that, thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with MRAC constituents. And I know you guys are doing a lot, and you need your assistance. So anything else you need from me at this point?
I don't think so.
Just let me know going down. I'm running as soon as possible.
All right. Cool.
You might find that it's loud sometimes, that sewing machine and things in the hallway. So if you shut the door, it's unlocked so people can come in.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
And if folks need the room adjusted and no these brick walls, can just let me know and we'll make adjustments as needed.
That doesn't work very well.
Oh, the from the staff?
Yeah, you
No,
can
I don't
type
say
that. Okay,
so. I just
okay,
don't
okay.
need somebody there.
Just go to, yeah. So we don't control it, unfortunately, so players are always there.
Okay.
Jumping jacks if you're cold and all the time.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, glad to be here. Glad that you guys took time out of a great, beautiful day to sit and have conversations about cultural competence. And so, how many people have been in a presentation that I've done before? Okay, cool. You guys were at MCM, right?
It was here.
Oh, it's here, okay. All right, nice, okay, so cool. I do so many trainings, it's hard for me to put faces in context, right? So thank you for that. So it should be pretty obvious that I have a PowerPoint slide. I have PowerPoints. I have handouts. I am prepared. I have my materials ready to go. But even given that, I'm curious as to what you were hoping to get out of this particular training, at this particular time we're going to spend together. So if you could, and I'm making the assumption that everyone doesn't know everyone else in the room. Is that a safe assumption? So if you could just say your name, your organization, and what are you hoping to get out of the training session today? It'd be great. You go to start.
Sure. I'm Sarah Nassif, and I'm a member of the on the Leaderfield board. And I'm also active in my neighborhood public partnership there. I'm a teaching artist, so say what I want to get out of it.
Yeah. So yeah, what were you hoping we would talk about?
Well, I'm just excited to learn anything and everything I can and build my skill set, because I have both my own, background of growing up with, in an era when it was colorblind and you really didn't want to talk about anything because it was supposed to be everything was fit story by the time in grade school. So I feel like I don't have a lot of skills and confidence around multicultural discussions. But also I work with a lot of older people, and you know, that can also be a barrier there, where there's an expectation that everybody should be held to the exact same, you know, European standard of, you know, organization, or what have you, you know. So trying to think about how leadership looks in different cultures and build something around it is good.
All right. Cool.
Hi, I'm Casey McKinnon. I work on your communication, and that's like 2 minutes later. I'm attended this session today just because I'm also probably the learner more, and I was trying to really good. I'm Julie, I'm part of the material theater project in the university. I'm a communicator. Here for same thing, to be a good ally, to really understand different people's perspectives and care about that, and really realize it. See how people see it.
I'm Angela, not with an organization, and leadership in cities without the media. Thank you. And I'm here, hoping for all of you, all you have said so far, and attending this class will inform my art, which I have to be invited to make sure that I am inclusive and the edge of where I could be or where we're all going to be. Cool.
Hi, I'm Courtney. I work in American art, making I'm doing a engagement there. And many things, I think the two biggest pieces for me right now, in my job, I am engaging with folks from many communities. And I need to continue to practice the skill of being in conflict with people, but in a relationship, and not necessarily being comfortable, but being honest with each other and caring. And then another strand of that maybe is I struggle to be patient and civil with fellow white folks who are on this journey. I recognizing that when I opt out instead of calling in to ask for something, I'm exercising my courage. And so I think part of it is bravery and habits. I know I need to, I work with multiple category art organizations as part of that part. So working with peers, with the arts council, so they're part of and I find that in often in places of shepherding lots of different groups, whether it's formal or smaller, all from different places, and trying to help people listen to each other, help people try to see broader than their smaller group. Just really tools and skills to help lots of small organizations just do a better job at all of this. And I just find it's just a challenging time to know what strategies to use and how to do this work. And it's just kind of a time of unrest and instability. And it's really hard to do that connectors when it's not just fun. But it's struggling with how we do that better.
Cool. I want to say I'm humbled and I'm thankful that you're all in this room together, and we've got a lot to cover in a little bit of time if we actually want to change the world. So I think it's important to make sure that we bite off as much as we can chew, right? And recognize, well, I'll tell you about me. So my I wanted to be a world changer. I wanted to, because people had, given me hopes and were counting on me to do certain things. I thought I would be the next civil rights leader to lead my people out of whatever, right? But then I realized that that was a very selfish thing because I wanted to be the leader. Now, where I've come to understand, or what I've come to understand, is that that's not my role. That's not my role. That's somebody else's role, and they did that. But my role is to run my leg of this race as best I can and not miss the handoff. And so I want us to start thinking about what is our responsibility in the spaces that we operate to be as effective as we possibly can. Right? And so ultimately, we may not necessarily, so I do lots of presentations in lots of places. Some are professionals, community members, stay-at-home parents, more often moms, and they're like, how do I do diversity work in my home? How do I do that in my home? And I shared with them that whatever you model in your house, whatever you model in your community, whatever you model in your family is what becomes said about you and demonstrates who you are. So it's not about, it is about the presence that we bring in those spaces. It is interesting that, so I don't curse. Sometimes it happens in my head, but it doesn't come out of my mouth, right? And so I'm talking with my neighbor across the street, and I live in Moundsview. I don't know if folks know where Moundsview is, but I'm talking with my neighbor, and he cusses like a sailor. I don't know how sailors curse any different than anybody else, but that's what they say, right? Cursing like a sailor. And every breath that comes out of his mouth is a curse word of some sort, some kind of interjection. And he uses it, it's masterful how he uses all these curse words to carry on a conversation, right? And he's blankety, blank. And I don't curse. But it was interesting, when we first started talking, he was cursing all the time. And I don't curse. But then he would catch himself and he'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry." Now, I never told him that I don't curse. I didn't tell him to stop cursing, but something about our interaction got him to start thinking about his own behavior. And he would start apologizing for cursing. I'm like, man, you curse. Do your thing. That's you, right? After about 8 months of time, when he communicated to me, curse words weren't a part of how we communicated. I didn't mandate that I don't have any opinion about his cursing, but apparently there was something that he was able to recognize about me that caused him to change his own behavior. And I wonder how we do that in our spheres of influence, right? If I had been dogmatic and I told him, I don't curse, so I don't want you to curse around me. What do you think would have come of that? Yeah, we probably would never talk, right? He'd be defensive, or he'd have all kinds of opinions about me. And to be quite honest, doing that kind of stuff, declaring my rightness, has nothing to do with it. Is not a great way to build relationships, right? So you can be right and not be effective. Right? And at this stage in my life, I'm trying to be effective. Even if it looks like I'm wrong, or people will say, "You let that person walk all over you." It might look like that, but I have a longer game that I'm playing, right? So yeah, I'm into winning, if you can use this, until I get a better metaphor, but I'm into winning wars over just the little battles, right? So there's that. And I also heard something that I'd like for you to think about, right? I kept hearing this word ally. So what is an ally? What does that mean? What's an ally?
To me, it's someone that's supportive but doesn't roll it up.
Okay, someone who's supportive but that doesn't roll over the top.
If someone is actively engaging and trying to be supportive, if that works, you know, or
Okay.
trying, it's like being, it's an active sounding.
So it's active sounding, maybe coming alongside, right? Working to do, okay? Other folks.
It's active and it is also an identity that someone outside of myself says, hey, I see this in you. It is a new reality.
Yeah. So here's the so there's a guy in the music industry, and his name is Dr. Dre. You ever heard of this guy? Right? Dr. Dre. So you get in a car accident, you go to the emergency room, and Dr. Dre shows up to examine you. How are you feeling about that?
I'm gonna ask them about Eminem.
You're gonna ask him about Eminem, right?
Yeah. Never mind why I'm there, so usually.
Like, this is really you. Oh my God. Tell me about
Is
Eminem.
this true?
Would you let him examine you? I mean, if you're coherent, would you?
No, I'd say, you might be called doctor, but I don't think that, I mean, he's not an MD.
So, if we wouldn't let Dr. Dre operate on us, and why is he not an MD?
He's not qualified.
What do you mean he's not qualified?
He's not educated
He's got an education,
in that particular.
so he doesn't have an education in that field
Or experience.
or experience
The knowledge.
or knowledge. When we talk about this idea of being an ally, what I want us to be mindful of is strictly to your point, that unfortunately, we don't get to call ourselves allies. Because it's very much like me being Andre, and I say, I'm going to be Dr. Dre. I'm Dr. Dre. And so I can either do the music thing or I try to do the surgery thing. I'm not qualified to be a doctor. Why?
For the same, because you don't have experience.
Okay, but let's say I have, anyone knows someone who's gone to law school, right? Finishing law school, does that make you a lawyer?
That's where the practice.
Oh, but if I'm practicing as a paralegal, if I'm practicing, does that make me a lawyer?
Certified by someone else.
I have to be certified by someone else. So Dr. Dre or Dr. Andre would not be would not be allowed to do medical procedures, even though I have the title and I may have some experience, but I haven't been certified by someone who says you have done all the things that you're supposed to do. And so when we talk about this idea of allyship, what I want us to think about is, yes, I want to do these practices, but who am I in relationship with that would say, that person is my ally? So I strive to think about that all the time because I was an advocate for women's rights. I am down for women, I'm supportive of women. And then I started thinking, how many women would say that about me? And then I started checking myself out and I was like, wow, maybe I need to do some things differently so that people will say those things about me because that's what I believe. Yeah, you were going to say something.
Well, with that in mind, maybe it's more the aspiration of being, I mean, how do you feel about that, the aspiration of becoming?
Yeah, no, and I'm all about this idea of becoming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're constantly becoming, but it's not until someone else certifies us that we, example, my daughter is 4 years old. I'm a great parent.
Didn't see the question yet?
When she gets older, she'll either confirm that, or she'll come up with something else, right?
She may do both.
She may in fact do both. I hope she's healthy and does both. But this idea that I just wanted to get us to think about that. It is about the actions. It's about how do we engage, and that others in those relationships get to help us be allies. Right? So no, we're becoming, we're yearning, we're in the struggle. But I don't know that necessarily I don't know if there's an arrival date until someone is. I can say that about you. So that's just something to think about. At least that's something I've been thinking about in my own on my own journey. Yeah.
And feel good about themselves where they're not really there. It's like good there with my family.
Look, I just want to tell you, I marched with Dr. Koen.
Andre, I think it's this.
Yeah.
No. I'm saying that's what people say, right? I mean, that's their rationale for being down for the movement, or in modern vernacular, being woke, right? You know, no, I was at the Women's March in Washington. So right,
So what did you do after that?
right, and so that's where this.
Kind of that, it's kind of your own way of saying, okay, I've got been there, done that. But, you know, maybe just make myself feel good. Where
Well, so
Curious.
so now we're kind of, I don't know how we got into the weeds, and this is not even a part of my thing, but I think it's important because we're here, right? So why do people want to do that? Why do people want to say I'm a part of a movement, or I'm down, or I'm conscious, or I know what's going on, I'm hip? Yes.
I find it really uncomfortable and a big challenge and really kind of my mission right now to reconstruct my own view of myself as a part of white supremacist society. And that is not a fun, I mean, it's hard. It's really hard, and I don't want to see myself as a member of a group that is despicable in any way, especially if I think I'm doing as much good as I can. But
So people want to see themselves as good because they think this is about good and bad. Because that's what's been set up, is good and bad. Right?
What I have found most of my life, even in New York City and then in the South, the longest 20 years, it's just plain embarrassing being white. It is embarrassing, and I don't know if anyone's ever felt that, because these people, black folks, don't think I am, and then white folks think that I am, and then men think I am.
Yeah.
And it's just embarrassing. It's hard to live as I am because I'm something other than what I am.
I'm full of this electricity because I'm feeling this stuff because we're about to make some serious breakthroughs on some stuff, right? So this idea of being embarrassed to be white, that and Sarah, I would suggest that you are on a great path. I'd like to elevate your thinking just a bit so that you can have a bigger purview of where we are and make sense of that. Because people have heard of white supremacy, right? And when people use that phraseology, because I didn't introduce that word, Sarah introduced that word into our conversation.
My friend introduced it to me, so.
Yep.
And I mean, the first time that I heard it, of course, my only association is KKK.
Right,
and
yep.
Nazis and certainly not where I live.
Yeah.
And I think, I guess I don't know exactly how, I'm here because I don't really know how to talk about any of this, but I know it exists and I want to work on ways to,
No, and I want to help you, and we're going to get there. That's why we're here, right? That's why we're here. So let's do this. If you have a smartphone, get that out, because we're going to be looking at some words and looking at some stuff on your smartphone. If you don't have a smartphone, you just pair with someone who does. What I'd like you to do is to look up the word primacy. Primacy. because this is going to help us think about things a little bit differently. So Julie, do you have primacy? What does primacy mean?
Primacy, the fact of being primary, preeminent, or important.
Primary, right? So what are the primary colors? Red, blue, green. No, green is a mix.
Yeah, yellow.
Red, blue, and yellow. So there's 3. Right? Okay. So those are the. And so if I want to make any other colors, I just mix those, right? When you're going to start on a canvas, or you want to paint a wall, or you want to paint a deck chair, what's the first thing that you put on there?
Primer.
The primer, right? So the primer. So what I'd like to offer to you is a more sophisticated way of thinking about this idea of white supremacy. Because particularly when you say that, people just go, gates go up, you're like, no, that's not me, I'm not, right? Let's not talk about it. You're ruining things, right? Anybody see Adam Ruins Everything or something like that? I think it's a comedian who does social commentary or whatever. But it's actually, I would suggest that white supremacy is a side effect of something more central, which is white primacy. That everything gets measured against this idea of whiteness, right? And there's a very thin thread that makes whiteness work. And what is it that makes whiteness function? What makes whiteness function? Power? Okay.
Assumptions?
Assumptions about what?
Well, what makes white function is white makes money. You can see that these atrocities that have been committed by white people, not only white people, there's not a race on this earth that have not committed an atrocity against their own kind.
Correct.
But we do it here, so now we're saying white. But I mean, you're Alexander the Great, and you go through history, human beings exploring human beings, slaves is not unique. What makes white good is probably terror.
Okay.
But it is
Terror.
What can be done?
Okay. That is a possibility. That's not where I was going, but I'll put that. We can tuck that in there. What makes whiteness work? A sense of superiority. I think that's interesting. A sense of superiority.
Complacency or simplicity. Just accept the subconscious acceptance or basically the reverse of questioning why it works. It's
So-
giving, or isn't, I mean,
That's
that's as far as.
No, you're good. Because I want you to, this is the exercise room, right? So we're on the track,
Right,
we're in the
well, like I
elliptical
felt
of diversity stuff. We're doing it, right? No, this is good.
Well, because I grew up really, with this idea, and again, with the, I went to an all-girls high school, and I had this idea by the time I graduated, like, I would never call myself a feminist in high school, because that was so passé, like, it was done. And then I went to go to college and found out what it was like, and sort of, so 30 years later, I've had certain assumptions about the way that our society is built and how opportunity exists, and I listen to people talk about affirmative action, good or bad, like, I should have gotten into Georgetown, but they have
But
blah,
they
blah,
didn't.
blah, blah.
Yep.
And, and finding myself in these social situations where I'm just like, I don't know how to process I don't know how to.
Okay. So we'll back into it.
I'm working
right?
hard and not getting it.
No, you're doing great, and the fact that you are willing to be on a journey that you're unsure of, you're halfway to your destination. Just the fact that you're thinking about these and you don't know how to answer these things, because I will tell you, people who aren't thinking about it have very simple answers. Right? People who aren't critical thinkers, they can pop off an answer like that. It's those of us who wrestle with this stuff. And it's so interesting because it makes us feel like we're incompetent to deal with this.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm okay with feeling like that, but.
No,
But you know,
but that's the
why people
skill.
don't wanna do it.
Yeah, but that's the skill you need to be competent. Right? You need that critical. So let's back into it this way. What do white people say about other white people who don't measure up to the level of sophistication that most white people think they should?
They're a leader.
They call them a loser. They call them what? They call them white trash. What else do they call them?
Lazy.
They call them lazy, redneck, Hoosier, right? Hoosier is, it's got two things in, when I was in Missouri, that's what they would call redneck people, they call them Hoosiers. In Indiana, Hoosiers is a good thing, that they're, right? So Hoosier. So context is everything, right? So wait a minute. So you mean white people have names for white people who aren't like what?
White people.
Like the rest of white people. So the way whiteness works is the assumption that all white people are created equal. That we're all equal, right? So this is what I'd like to just jump back. 1776, 78. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Good stuff. Who are they talking about?
White men.
Educated white men who own land. Now, in those early days, was that the majority of white men in America? It was not. It was a small minority. So here it is. We've been tricked into adopting a theology, a way of thinking that wasn't originally designed for all of us. I will tell you, if you are a working stiff, those words were not necessarily designed for you. They now apply to you, but they weren't designed for you. Right? So this idea of whiteness, this idea of primacy, and you can see it in terms of, did I put it in the, I don't think I put it in the PowerPoint, but no, you can look it up. I can look it up. So you can see it in how we even talk about so-called race and ethnicities, right? It is always balanced off of, it's white and something else, right? It's always, so white has become primacy. I mean, it's primary.
White or minority.
So it can be white or minority, but it's always against. I mean, the balance is against this primal thing. And so one thing we have to challenge in ourselves is, what is the purpose of that primacy? Why does that primacy exist? Because supremacy comes out of the primacy. Without the primacy, we wouldn't have supremacy. And why do we have supremacy? Going back to one of the original questions that I wrote down that sparked something for me was, why do people feel they need to be better than somebody else? Let's start there. Because they feel bad about themselves. What do you call that? Inferiority. Inferiority. And when people feel inferior, what do they do so that they don't feel inferior any longer? So they have to make someone less than themselves, right? So actually, and so I've been really working on this idea of racism because I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I become actionable in helping folks overcome this racial stuff, right? So Sarah, we're on the same journey, right? Different lanes, different contexts, but we're the same journey. And so it occurred to me a couple of things. That one, racism is arrogance. It's rooted in arrogance, right? Because people want to be primary, right? So it's rooted in arrogance. What it is also rooted in, it is also rooted in inferiority. So to deal with my inferiority, I typically try to compensate. right? So I try to compensate. Lots of comedians do this a lot. So I think Richard Pryor was probably one of the best who did it, where he would be self-abasing, right? So he would talk bad about himself. I think Eminem did it in 8 Mile, right? I don't know if anybody saw that movie, 8 Mile. It was a masterful job. He was a white guy from Detroit going into this rap battle, and the other guy had all this dirt on him, you know, that his friend had slept with his mom, and, you know, they lived in a trailer and all this stuff. So they had all this bad stuff. So Eminem comes out and he starts rapping about his own stuff. He was like, I know my mom slept with your friend, and we live in trash and blah, 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 blah. He became very self-abasing, right? Because he wanted to compensate for his inferiority. Now, what happens when we compensate too much?
Someone believes it.
Someone believes it.
Well, you know, this. I don't believe it. I'm not calling it. It's really the logo. You know, and so wow, you have everything. You got your PhD and you're crashing. Pretty much everyone in the community that's the government. You know, that's just really the logo on their car. So in their overcompensation, they miss the world, according to me. They miss like the truth.
They relieve themselves of the responsibility to
Yes.
do better because you can't help it. Well, I'm just stupid, I never get this, and I don't know what to say.
So what does overcompensation look like?
It can look like anything. I mean, it's definitely an excess.
So it's an excess, right?
Excess.
It looks like excess. It might look like superiority,
Oh, sorry, I'm going the other way.
right?
Right.
So overcompensation may look like superiority. So I am the superior whatever. Why? Because I'm overcompensating. I'm in excess for my inferiority. So if racism is partly rooted in this idea that it's arrogance, that becomes helpful to me because I know how to deal with arrogance. What helps with arrogance? If someone is arrogant, how can you help them? What's the antidote to that? Go ahead, Gordon. Humility! You listen.
Hear what they're doing.
You become a servant to the people who you think you're superior to. Right? Humility. Sometimes that humility has to come from us when we're dealing with these people who are overcompensating for their own inferiority. And so that humility might sound like, well, that's interesting that you would say that about those group of people. Have you had a time in your life when that could have happened to you? Or is there a decision that bringing them back to reality, into owning their inferiority, right? Because certain news stations and TV shows and all sorts of stuff, they revel in exploiting people's fear of inferiority. Right? But to be inferior is to be human. That's why we love the arts, right? Even when we see stuff going on stage and it's not going well, we're rooting for those folks because we know I couldn't do that, right? We want them to win every time, even if it's a bad thing. We're rooting for them because our inferiority hits us and says, well, I don't know that I can do that. They're braver than I. And so that becomes important for us to recognize. So let's get to our handout, right? So what is it that really fuels or can help us Because we can overcompensate, we can undercompensate, right? That's it. So, and what do we call it when people undercompensate themselves? And that's not even like a real thing. I mean, that's not a phraseology we would use, but if we go that far down, what do we call that? They may have blinders on. What else? What else do we call that? So, an overabundance of negative excess. How might that manifest? It could be guilt. It could be narcissism, right? It could manifest itself as, not the clinical, but the blues, right? Being down on myself, being depressed at that blues level, not necessarily clinical depression, but that blues level, right? So all those things can be on that negative end of that undercompensation, if you will. So that's important. So how do we stabilize? What do we do to kind of stabilize how we think about ourselves in our inferiority? Well, one of the things that we must understand that there are 3 drives to human behavior. All people are looking for significance, belonging, and safety. Significance suggests that I'm a person with purpose and power. I was born for a reason. Whether I decide what that reason is or God tells me what that reason is, right? But I have a reason for being. I can do something. I'm significant. Secondly, is that I want to be in relationships with people who understand my significance. Belonging. Why do we join community choirs? Why do we join clubs? Why do we have certain people as our friends and not other people as our friends? Because they understand. I'm with people who understand what I can give. And then lastly, people want to be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually safe to be in relationships with people who understand their significance. So we're all looking for significance, belonging, and safety. We're all looking for that. So why do kids join gangs? One of those 3 things, or all 3 of those 3 things, right? Can they find significance in a gang?
Yes.
Yeah. Can they find belonging in a gang? Can they find safety in a gang? Certainly, right? Meets their needs. Why do we go to work? Do we find significance in our work? Do we find belonging in our work? Do we find safety in the process of working? And so we're all looking for those. We're all looking for those things. And so if we can understand that as a core value in relating to other people, the question then becomes not what are they looking for, but how are they looking for the same thing I'm looking for. Right? So that's where we get into. Let's go to this large circle, and we'll call this circle the circle of all human knowledge. Okay, it's a little late in the afternoon for that, right? But let's call this the pie of all knowledge. What I'd like for you to do is to cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. What do you know of everything there is to know? So you just draw that, just humor me too. Just humor me.
Draw a circle.
Yep. So you can do it right in that center circle on your page or on your own, in your own notes. That's fine. So what are some examples of things that you know for sure?
I know about plants.
You know about plants. All right, cool. Somebody else that you know for sure. You know your own experience. Just one more.
I know that I know everything, I just don't know it yet.
Okay, so you know everything, but you just don't know it yet. Okay,
Right.
cool. I can roll with that. All right. So what I want you to do now is to cut a second piece of pie. And the second piece of pie will be the size of what you do not know. Now, some people will say, well, that's just the rest of the pie. I want you to challenge yourself and see if you can make it quantifiable, right? So your second piece of pie, the size of what you know you do not know. For example, I'm aware of the fact that I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I'm aware of the fact that I don't know how to fly an airplane, and I also don't know how to do open heart surgery, right? So I know that I don't know those things. So quantify that second piece of the pie. Because there will be a third piece. And we'll talk about that third piece in just a second.
This is the whole universe of knowledge?
Yeah, so everything that there is to know. What do you know? What are you aware of that you do not know? Compared to what you know for sure. So what are some examples of things that people know? You know where you live. All right, cool. Please raise your hand if you also know where you live. All right, cool. One more thing that someone knows that they don't know. I'm sorry, yeah, that's where we are. We're at what do you know you don't know? I'm sorry, Julie. Okay, raise your hand if you know that you do not know how to play a musical instrument, or the guitar specifically. Okay, cool. All right. One more that you know you do not know. All right, so please raise your hand if you also know that you don't know all about chemical engineering. All right, cool. So we have what we know, we have what we know we don't know, and what do you think is that third piece?
Don't know, we don't know.
What you don't know, or blind spot. So write the word blind spot in that third piece of pie, blind spot. And there are a number of different kinds of blind spots, and we won't have time to go through them all today, but we'll talk about a couple. But yeah, so then we have blind spots. So when you look at your circle, what do you recognize about your circle? About your pie?
My blind spot for the
That your blind spot is the biggest piece. Is that true for other people as well? All right, cool. So if we take what we know, and we take what we know we don't know, and we take what our blind spots are, and we put all those three things together, we might call that a paradigm. Paradigm. I used to be hooked on phonics. I said paradigm. It worked for me, right? So paradigm. And what is a paradigm? It's a structure for thinking. What else is a paradigm?
The model.
It's a model. What else is a paradigm? A way of organizing. Or a pattern, right? So who was responsible for giving you your first paradigm? Your parents. And where did your parents get their paradigm? From their parents. And where did their parents get their paradigm? Have you ever received a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? Does it look exactly like the original by the time it's been copied? That many times? No. How is it different?
A little bit is left out every single time.
So a little bit is left out every single time. Sometimes it's smudged.
Sometimes things are added in.
Sometimes the things are added in, people's notes or dust right? So it doesn't look exactly like the original. So is it possible that our paradigm, how we see the world, that's how I like to characterize a paradigm, is how you see the world, could be faulty? Could we be operating with faulty paradigms? And why would that be?
That copy was really hard to read.
Because the copy is hard to read, right? The context changes. And context is everything. Context is everything. Right? So, what I'd like to suggest to you is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. We don't see it as it is. We see the world as we are. We're constantly filtering information not through the truth or the reality of the situation, but of our own paradigms. Right? So if you look at the bottom of the page, you see the world through your genders, through your so-called race, your geography, or the government you were raised in, right? And if that gender is different, or that race is different, or that geography is different, or that governmental structure is different, you would see the world differently. You see the world differently. And so paradigms impact our attitudes. How we see the world impacts the kinds of things that we do. And what is an attitude? What's an attitude? So it's an ingrained response. Response to what?
Whatever you're looking at.
So whatever we're looking at, okay? Attitude. A set of assumptions. That come out as a response. This is what I'd like to offer you. So my dad was my pastor growing up. So I'm a preacher's kid. And so on Sunday, we would go to church from 7:30 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. We stop at 3 o'clock for chicken, not because we're black, but because chicken is delicious. Okay? So all day church on Sunday. Friday night, I asked my dad for the car, and my dad loves me. So what does he say? He says, yes, he loves me, right? He gives me the keys. So I take the keys, I pick up my friends, we go cruising for girls. I don't know what would happen had we found girls, but I fill up the car with gas before I come home, and I come home before curfew. I hand my dad the keys, and he says I have what kind of an attitude? A good attitude, a grateful attitude, a positive attitude. So Friday night, my dad and I are cool. My best friend Dexter calls me on Sunday and says, Andre, can you pick me up for the movies? What do I know about Sunday? Church all day, I'm busy, right? But I'm 17 and I'm invincible. So I go up to my dad and I say, Dad, can I borrow the car? And what does he say? What does he say?
Are you crazy? You know,
Yeah, he gives me a sermon. And the worst thing in our household was if you didn't do what you're supposed to, you were going to hell. And my dad would either show you the way to hell or you could go on your own, right? As a result of that interaction, what do you think my attitude was?
defensive.
So it's defensive, angry, frustration, shame. I had a bad attitude. It took me a long time to figure out the mystery behind that event happening for me, right? Because all too often I was trying to figure out what an attitude was, and I didn't have people who could articulate enough for me exactly what they meant by changing your attitude, right? Because my parents would say goofy stuff like, boy, I don't like your attitude, fix your face, right? Or, go to your room till you learn how to act. And I get my act together and I come out, to be or not to be. And that's not what they were talking about, right? So it took me a long time to process this and figure it out. And this is what dinged for me. And I'm glad I got it. I finally got it. That an attitude is a side effect. It's a smoke screen. It leads us to something else. When did I have a good attitude? When I was behaving the way he expected me to? Partially. When did I have a good attitude or a great attitude? Attitudes are about goal accomplishments. So when you get what you want, you have what kind of an attitude? A good attitude. When you're not getting what you want, you have a bad attitude. So when I see someone with an attitude, either positive or negative, they are telling me about their ability to accomplish their goals. Their ability to accomplish their goals. And if I help people accomplish their goals, do you think that gives them significance, belonging, or safety? Yeah, it does. If they're not getting significance, belonging, or safety in my interactions, do you think they're going to have a good attitude? No. Right? So when we talk about this idea of attitude, because it's easy to get caught up in the emotional affects or the drama of attitudes, right? The stomping of the tensing of the body and the face and the brow. It's easy to get distracted by that thing. When in fact, all we have to do is find out what is the goal, and if we can be helpful. So what's the goal? Yeah.
The goal be not only personal but contextual. So your attitude won't be pressing the friends around you by being more.
Yeah.
So again, kind of your own goal or your own goal might be fitting and testing the stuff. I didn't lose face.
And I would say that all of our goals are always contextual. That everything's contextual, right? So I might act out like, because you'll hear parents say it all the time. But Johnny doesn't do that at home. There's a different context at home, right? You're not watching Johnny now this season either. But so context goes back. Context is everything, right? So important stuff. Thoughts so far. Does this stuff make sense? Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and make this leap. What do you think this idea of significance, belonging, and safety, and talking about paradigms and talking about attitudes, what does this have to do with having cultural competence?
The formula is different for everyone.
The formula is different for everyone. What?
I keep going back to what a very good in this country at finding other people, going back to the good and so when you're denying someone the complexity of who they are, even when you're denying their own complexity, it's going to get stuck.
Yeah.
So how do you nurture out of that?
How do you nurture out of that way of operating? Right? Okay, I'm going to, yes.
And what about that whole, some of this is the mental skills, where I want to protect, my own, my time, my whatever, then I'll lose something.
Yeah.
So it's like, if someone else has power, someone else has something, and I'm going to do that. So that instead of all boats rising, it's like, my boat better get there first.
Yeah.
And your boat, then, I don't care whatever you do, but I'm going to do it. And so it's not this thing too of this protectionism maybe of your own whatever that makes you kind of.
So I'm even more cynical than you are. And so I'm not saying you're cynical, I'm just saying I'm extreme cynic, right? It's the capitalistic model. Supply and demand. The pie is only so big. That's not true. And life is not pie, right? So I was sharing a story because we were talking about this, and someone was like, well, I got to get mine, and if you don't get yours, that's too bad, or you have the same opportunity to get yours, blah blah blah. But what if I don't want the same thing you want? So what is that, right? And so I give this story. My wife was making some buttermilk biscuits, and she went to go grab some buttermilk, and there wasn't any in the thing. And so we had company coming over, and I was like, well, I'll just go to the store. She was like, no, I got it. I was like, really? She was like, yeah. Guess what she did? She took lemons and squeezed it into regular milk and curdled, and all of a sudden, she had her buttermilk, right? So we live in abundance. We don't all want the same thing. And that's one of the things we have to not let people scare us into, which is that if I don't get mine, or they're coming to get my stuff, to be quite honest, you don't come in with anything, and you can't leave with anything, right? So that scarcity model is something that we also have to wrestle with. And so when we're able to give people significance, we're able to give them belonging, we're able to give them safety, we can help them have better attitudes. And we have to recognize that context drives how we get these things, right? Now, I'm gonna put this out here, I'm not trying to be sensational, but I do want you to be a critical thinker about this, right? What is it that the white nationalists want?
All of those things.
They want safety, significance, and belonging. Right? If I can cut away all the other antics, if I can cut away all the other antics and not get caught up in their drama of the antics that they're doing, I can actually have a what with these folks? I can have a real conversation because they want the same thing I do. But how they want to get those things is very different than how I want to get them. But if I can talk about those core values, then I'm able to close these cultural divides, right? What is it that Muslims want? They want the same things I want, but how they want to get those things is very different, or maybe very different, or maybe not as different as I think that it might be, right? So the safety, significance, and belonging, this helps us to cut through, shortcut, right? And I remember WordPerfect, they had all these little shortcut keys, and bam, you can do all sorts of stuff. But now, now I don't know what's going on with Windows or iOS or whatever. But no, so we can shortcut some of this stuff if we can recognize what people are after, because we can't get caught up in their drama, right? I never forget my parents, and I had them for a long time. They'd ask me to do something, and I'd act up. And what did that act up do to what they asked me to do? It distracted my parents. And so now we're talking about the thing I'm doing to act up, and I don't have to do what the original intent was. And as a kid, I won. Even if I got sent to my room, I wasn't doing what they wanted me to do, so I won. But after a while, my parents got hip, and they just ignored my antics. Son, take out the trash. Son, take out the trash. Son, take out the trash. Not engaging in any of my back talk or other things because they wanted me to stay focused on the goal. Right? So, important stuff. So let's flip over to page 2. And at the bottom of page 2 are, no, I want to do this really quick. Because it's going to set the stage for what's on page 2. Should we take a quick break? Are people in need of a quick break? No? Okay, let's keep going. All right, cool. Well, no, let's start here. It is important that we think differently about the world, right? So this is, let me start here. So this is the 1980 election of President Reagan. And there were 4 states. Oh, well, what do you notice about that particular map? It is mostly red, right? Except for 4 places, which is interesting. Minnesota, Georgia, West Virginia, and Hawaii were the only so-called blue states, right? Does anybody know why Minnesota or Georgia? What's that? It was Walter Mondale and Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was former governor of Georgia, and Walter Mondale is from the great state of Minnesota. So let's give them a hand for carrying their own states, right? That's a good effort. So we have this. So we have this map, and what is the red and the blue supposed to symbolize? Because this is the results of the 2016 election of Donald J. Trump. So what is this blue and red supposed to mean? Republican or Democrat, right? Conservative or liberal, right? That's how they've tried to run the way we talk about this stuff, right? Here's something I think is kind of interesting, though. So here, Minnesota is what color? Blue. But here's the election map by counties. Now, if we take that same narrative that has been given to us, we miss an opportunity to see what's really going on. Because what they tell us is that this is, what is this? The Republican.
Rural.
Rural. It's conservative, right? And then these areas, they would say are Democratic and liberal. If we go along the lines of how this narrative has been created, we miss an opportunity to see something even more fundamental. And what do you think the more fundamental story is that's going on in this particular graphic?
Density of population.
Density of population. Say more about that.
The places where it's blue, there's denser populations.
There's more people, right? More people from where?
Together in a close connection.
In a close connection. These are the places where people are practicing diversity. And these are places that what?
There's not much.
They don't have the opportunity to practice. If I just went along the lines of red and blue, because when they tried to do this, they got the election wrong. And you know why? Those people who were at those exit polls, bless you, were doing those, got the exit polls wrong. They were asking the wrong questions. They didn't understand that this election was about ideologies, about relationships, as this map clearly lets us know. If we want to change, we have to know where we are. Which means that we have a lot of donors in these areas, we have a lot of constituents, we have theater goers in these places, and if I don't give them time to practice, when I go to take my craft out there, what are they going to say about my craft? That's not for me. That's not my thing. Right? And so we have to build better relationships in Minnesota. This map, and even the previous one, I believe, is much more about, if you look at that from that relationship lens, you start to see something different in this map. Right? The places where there's lots of opportunities to practice. Chicago's a big place. Got to practice, right? Cool. So if we don't know where we are, then if we don't understand the context, because context is everything, we don't understand a lot of things. And so this idea of being inferior and all of this stuff, Yuri Brofsenbrenner talks about this in his ecological model, that there are all of these things that shape our paradigm, shape how we see the world, shape how we interact with each other, learn the morals, the mores of culture, and it all stems right out of our context. So Yuri Brofsenbrenner. So when you get a chance, do some research on Yuri. He started a program, he was one of the pioneers that had the scientific backing for a program that I was a part of as a small child called HeadStart. Have you heard of HeadStart? Right? Apparently that was for poor kids. HeadStart. You know what's really interesting about being in HeadStart? I never knew I was poor. I had teachers who supported me, administrators who loved me. I had teachers' aides and bus drivers who, every time I saw them, they talked to me about the importance of going to school. They didn't know it was a special program. Right? So Yuri Brofsenbrenner really helps us to look at these microsystems, these mesosystems, these ecosystems, and the macrosystems. Look at the context by which we are raised. No, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to this. Because I talked a lot about this other stuff later. I'll talk about that other stuff later. So because I'm just a proud parent, I just want to show you my daughter. That's my daughter right there. You can't see her that well because the lights are on, but she's cute. Take my word for it, right? So there's that. So let's get right into into this idea of social justice, because one thing that, if you can carry this with you as well, that social justice has gotten a bad label, right? People really have thought it means this kind of leftist, fluffy, rabid, kind of airy. Anybody? What's that foam on the top of drinks at Starbucks? Froth. Okay, so froth, right? But social justice really is trying to make sure that everyone gets back into the picture. So that when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, or we talk about the preamble to the Constitution, it was set for very specific people. However, social justice is saying that those same words apply to me too, right? So it's a different kind of being introduced back in. So making sure everyone is back in the picture. So let's talk about this idea of culture. And so one of the things that I know is that context is everything. So the model that I like to use for talking about cultural competence is the carrot model. The carrot model is very simple, that there are things that we can see about a culture and things that we can't see about a culture, right? So the top of the carrot we would call what? What do you call that? The greens, right? So the greens and the root of the carrot have a relationship. What is their relationship? One feeds the others. And how does that work, Julie?
Greens, taking, not really about science. The energy from the universe and feed the root or the carrot.
Right, so they take in energy from the sun, and it feeds it to the photosynthesis happens, and it feeds it to the carrot, right? And what does the carrot do for the greens?
Takes up water and mineral.
Waters a mineral from the soil and gives. So they need each other. They are connected to one another, right? It is a symbiotic relationship between those two, right? So one of the assumptions that I have is that when I see the greens, what's a natural assumption to make? That there's a carrot underneath. That there's a carrot underneath, right? So let's call the greens the artifacts of culture. The artifacts of culture. And what are some examples of artifacts of culture? Language, dress, food.
What you're taught in school.
What you're taught in school. Music. Movies, right? So these are all artifacts of the culture. We'll call the root of culture, we'll call those values, right? So the things that I can see about a culture, the greens, are artifacts. The things that I can't see are the roots of culture, which is the values. So when I see an artifact, what must I recognize about that artifact? Something's feeding it. And what do we know is feeding it? Values. So artifacts become the physical manifestation of values. Of values. So when we talk about this idea of this carrot of culture, that becomes the way that helps me shortcut a lot of stuff, right? So when I taught high school, we had this problem with our students. And the problem was that many of them had their pants sagging. I don't know if you've ever seen that or whatnot. And I was the pull up your pants police. I was passing out demerit tickets. Pull up your pants, pull up your pants, pull up your pants. And I was so bad at it that I started doing it out in the world. Right? I would see people with their pants sagging and I go, and you know, the thing that was strange about that is that they would actually pull up their pants. Perfect strangers would actually pull up their pants when I asked them to, right? Just interesting stuff, right? And I kept doing that until I came to a realization. What were sagging pants doing for my students? Yes.
Significance, belonging.
Safety, significance, and belonging. And these artifacts are tied to values. So if I said that your artifact is dumb, what am I saying? My values are dumb. Your values are wrong, right? How far do you think that gets you, telling people that their value system is wrong, or what they think is important is dumb? Didn't get you very far at all, right? So I saw a movie called Stand and Deliver. Has anyone seen that? With James Olmos and Lou Diamond Phillips. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and see it. It's a great film. It's from the 80s, so the acting is a little cheesy 80s acting, you know. Michael Mann was kind of doing, Anyway, so I don't like when he messes up good stuff. Like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they didn't need to be the Hulk, and the lady reporter could have kept her, Anyway, so when we talk about this connection, so what I saw Stand and Deliver, and there's a scene in the movie where Lou Diamond Phillips is talking to John Almost, and they're talking. He's the teacher, and Lou Diamond Phillips is the kid, and he's got this. He's doing like this bad Mexican accent. And he comes up to the teacher and he says, "Yo, teach. I need some home books." And the teacher's like, "What are you talking about, home books?" He said, "I just gave you a set of books last week." He was like, "Yeah, those are my school books. I need some home books." And he's still puzzled. He said, "Look, teach, I want to do your work, but I can't be seen in my neighborhood carrying no books. So I need books for school, and I need books for home." That's what the teacher said. "I'll get you some home books." Right? All too often, with my students, I was telling them to pull up their pants, but what I didn't realize was that was a strategic advantage for them in their context. So did I need my students to pull up their pants? No. Did I have to keep telling my students to pull up their pants? No. I just had to teach them what to do in a different context. Because there are contexts where they live where it was important to have your pants sagging just like everybody else. But then there were contexts where that skill in your community will be a liability in the workplace. Right? So I taught them about different contexts. So when we talk about context is everything. So understanding how this works is extremely important. So artifacts are the physical manifestations of values. The physical manifestation of values. And what are values? Where do values come from? They come from parents. But where do parents get them? They come from the paradigm. What else?
Well, I guess German parents, or Irish parents, French parents, go through this is a long life in this, whether I come from.
And why have they always done it that way in this German, Irish, French family?
I'm not sure that they always do that.
No, I know people say that though, but why has it carried on?
It must have worked for them.
Because people think that it works. So values are these things that we pass on because we think it's effective. We think that it's effective to do what?
Get people to behave when their hands up, They don't
To be, to keep humanity going, right? We have these values because our genes are calling out, I need to survive, keep humanity going, and we believe that these values will help us do that. Every religious tradition has a set of key moral principles, no matter what it is. It's a set of key moral principles, and all of those are pro the existence of human beings, even if it's just their set of human beings, right? So values are really rooted in this idea that, or the concept that we need to progenerate ourselves in terms of humanity. So we do things, we believe things because somebody thought it was helpful, and then somebody else agreed with them and said, I think it's helpful too, right? And so when we have these artifacts, we also have to recognize what happens when these two things get disconnected. And so when the top of the carrot gets separated from the root of the carrot, what are the possible outcomes? They both can die, right? They both can die. So what do we call artifacts that have been disconnected from their values? We call those stereotypes. So have you ever seen a stereotype or heard a stereotype and said, well, isn't that kind of true about those people? And even if you didn't say it out loud, you just thought about it and you were like, well, aren't lines like that? Or, some people can't jump and, ever, right? Stereotype. We see an artifact, but we don't know the value of that artifact. I was born on October 30th. And as a kid, I loved it. Because you got the 3 C's. Costumes, cake, and candy. Right? Loved it. As an adult, I hate Halloween. Can you imagine why? Well, that too, but yeah, it is the purge, if you will, right? Of all anything racist is the purge in Halloween because you can dress up like people and think that it's fun, right? And so, and all too often people are doing stereotypes of stuff, right? I know a number of Native Americans, have tons in my family, know people in the community, chief leaders and whatnot, and they don't wear headdresses. So how is it that somebody else thinks that they can in trying to, whatever. So this idea, so stereotypes come when we don't understand the value. But let's say the rabbit eats the greens off my carrot. And I'm not one of those people that marks my garden very well. What am I doing?
The values are lost.
What's that?
The values are lost.
Yeah, the carrot is lost. I can't find it. I can't find it. And why can't I find it? I don't have any visible signs to it, right? So it's lost. So, but so I call this X, this red X here, I call that Ellis Island. Why might I call that Ellis Island in terms of the disconnection between the artifacts and the values?
Forced change.
It was forced change.
Inside of my family, 4 brothers had to take 4 different names.
They wouldn't let them keep the same name. They had 4 different names, right? Could folks bring all their stuff on the ships when they came? No. And even at the port of entry, people had to still leave stuff, right? Even their names. I also call this refugee camps. The X is refugee camps. Because people were fleeing war-torn countries and being forced into refugee camps and then placed into lotteries to see where they might go next. Right? So it's hard to maintain your artifacts in that kind of system. I would also call this X the effects of the transatlantic slave trade, right? Separating people, their artifacts from their thing. Now, here's the interesting thing about this, though, because there's hope. There's hope when this happens, when there's a disconnect. Because what happens if you leave your carrots in your refrigerator long enough? They start to regrow, right? They start growing again. Take some time. It may take a couple of generations. It may take 3 or 4 generations for things to start growing. And it's so funny because younger generations are like, why don't we do this anymore? I want to make krum kaka like grandma did. What's the recipe? How do I find out how to do the French Canadian, bursk or all sorts of stuff, right? They start, what's that?
Meat pies.
Meat pies. What are they called in Michigan? Pasties, right? How do we make those things, right? They start reaching back because they want to reconnect to these artifacts. Right? So, important stuff to recognize that, right? So the stem and the root of culture, and those grow in a context all their own. So on page 3, I make reference to this model again, just kind of talking about immigrants, refugees, ESL, historical trauma, poverty, and racism. These are all affects of a separation of values and artifacts, right? So what I'd like for you to do is select the culture that you belong to, and on page 3, I want you to kind of write down what are some of the artifacts of that culture. What meaning do these artifacts have? What function do these artifacts serve? And why do you think these artifacts were developed in the first place? And what relationship do you think these artifacts have to the values of the culture that you're talking about, right? So it could be a culture that you're born into, one you've selected, one that by nature of your location you are a part of. But I want you to think about that in terms of your culture, of a culture that you select. tricky questions? Wherever you are, you're thinking, you can just pause and you can continue later. What I'd like you to do is just one of the persons that you prepared and just kind of share some of your thoughts as you were going through answering these questions. So I'll give you about 6 minutes, so 3 minutes if you use. If you use less than that, that's fine.
Okay. Mine was another place. And so the artifacts. With food, kids, function of artifacts was, especially and also there's I read one about Podiums. You read one about Podiums? So, I grew up. It wasn't necessarily about how and you have to be in the whole thing. Together, twice. I had a hard time with it.
Yeah, you think a lot about it, and then the function of the
It doesn't even really matter what happens. Everything shipped out. You know how the machine is. And so it was one of the other values of something. That's how I make a lot of it.
anything called
We have 2 potatoes and 1 piece of sausage. No problem, everyone. Right. Right. And, yeah. So, I got this project called Shared Boundaries. Well, I was a collaborator on a project. So my father was an internal that was part of the larger public audience. So I could see his picture. So, and so the people are on, I didn't have any water bar. Yes. I've never been there, but I followed them in to his grave. Yeah. So, anyway, my progress was to draw the hands, and then I created boards with walls, including the library. The inside, because there's a lot of, yeah, in that area, we call that thing spot. So, they were celebrating what we could do. It's fun setting, because you know, a lot of people not really worrying about what the hell it is. Just, but I brought in this other about the vegetables and farmers market, and we brought, like a whole cabbage. Yeah. And then we started running I have, so basically, you come in, is
Yeah, I was right, like, they had, okay.
So I had not really.
Wow.
Yeah, so.
There's all the county herb.
You know, I think he has happy bells.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I know, I know.
So I know a little bit of fraction or what, but I know she's.
So.
Yeah.
So. Oh, gosh.
So I included, from all the different cultures.
We're just trying to place the board and like.
Oh, I was always so bad.
Four, three, two, one.
Please do. Yeah.
It's great. Thinking of more right.
All right. So cultures. Did you discover anything about yourself as you were going through that?
What's the matter of original environment?
Those roots are there, right? Whether you're in that original environment or not, those roots are there. Other things you discovered about yourself. Yes.
I saw part of my father when Angela pointed out in her family. which is a military background, and although my father wasn't active in the military at the time, and many of his trips were organizations.
So you found that you had some traits in common. You're similar.
I had not ever connected that to the military.
Swearing and keeping quiet. It's at appropriate times.
Yeah.
So lots of secrets, yeah.
Yeah.
My, just thinking about my grandfather served in Panama,
Or maybe that was.
and, but he never talked about it.
Yeah.
You know, and he spent some time in Korea, but he never talked about it, and very much that idea of secrets. And so what gets translated is there's some things you just don't talk about, right? And I see that in my father, I also see that in myself sometimes, right? Like, we're just not going to talk about it. So, important stuff. It's and it's important to, no matter what your answers were to these questions, it's important that you think about these questions, right? So, because artifacts have functions, they have functions. And what's the function of an artifact? To physically represent what? The value, right? The function of it is to represent value. The arts themselves are an artifact, right? And the value is all sorts of stuff. And when we look into antiquities and we see the things they left behind, we didn't get a chance to talk to those people. We don't necessarily know what they were thinking, but we take the artifacts and we try to make meaning of the artifacts they left us. Right? So artifacts are extremely important because they point directly to the value. Now it'll be really interesting if all the hieroglyphics in Egypt were just a cartoon of, about a guy named Sphinxy. It was just, that's a bad joke. I stole it from somebody else. So. At any rate, so there's that. So let's do this. Let's go over to, we're going to skip a little bit because this is a workbook more than it is anything else. If you go over to page 8, go over to page 8 in your handout, and make sure that it is 8. Yes, it is. Okay. So go to page 8. What I'd like you to do is to create because again, we're talking about context. Context is everything. And context as it relates to culture, and we'll talk about how when we pull those things together, what that means. But what I'd like for you to do is to create your family tree or a family constellation or a genogram, if those words make sense for you. And so what I'd like for you to do is to go back 3 generations, right? So you can start with your siblings and your parents, and then your grandparents, and then if they have any other siblings, remarriages, divorces count, being adopted counts, excommunicating your birth family and creating your own kind of family, that also counts, right? So however family is for you, what I'd like for you to do is go back 3 generations. And Melanie, we didn't do this. Teresa, we didn't do this last time, right? Okay, cool. A family tree, a family constellation, however so if you have siblings, you may want to add them if they're important. If their spouses or partners are important, you may want to add them as well. And if you don't know people's names, that's fine too. You can just put, a mental note for yourself, whether it's a grandma, grandpa, or aunt. And as you're doing that, what I'd like for you to do is to put 3 stars on your paper. I want you to note anyone that your family system or constellation or tree talks about a lot. Like these are people, pick 3 people that get talked about a lot, whether it's good or bad, whether they were notable or notorious, infamous or famous. So put 3 stars. Select 3 people. You put 1 star for each of those individuals. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, on the diagram, is it just my side of the family, or is it
However that works. Yeah, however you want to do it. Your side, your husband's side, your partner's side, however that works. So does everybody have at least 1 person starred that gets talked about a lot? Yeah, so like, Uncle Tommy is always drunk, he's always blah, blah, or, Grandpa was such a great patriot, people we get to talk about a lot. Either good or bad. Either good or bad. So, if you have stars around 3 of those, I want you to pick 1 of those individuals and put a circle around that star. So, out of the 3 people you starred, I want you to pick 1 of them, and I want you to put a star around that one. All right? For the one you just circled, the star you just circled, what are the words that are used to describe this person? So, what words are used to describe this person? How do people talk about them? Was she a scoundrel? Was he humble? What kind of words do you use to describe that person? All right. What time frame do you think that the words that were given to that person became actionable? Like, when did they either earn or grow into those words that describe them? So were they a small child? Was it in their early adult age? Was it later in life? But the words that they used to describe that person, when did that become? So what day, what decade, what year? Years, grouping of years, would you say? 50s, 20s, the 80s. And this is most of this is some speculation, so you don't have to necessarily know for sure, right? Just give it a fair running jump. All right. And my last question, and I'll leave you alone about this. Where were they when those words would have been applied to them, or they would have grown into those words? Were they in the United States? Were they outside of the United States? Were they in a war? Were they in a rural area, a suburban area, or an urban area? Where were they? Cool. So, my grandmother was my person. And I hope everybody has had a person that just belonged to you. Like nobody else, this is my favorite person. She was born my birthday is 14 days after her birthday, right? So Loved her, but misunderstood her most of my life. And I was really sad about that when I figured out why I misunderstood her, right? So my grandmother would do just things I thought were interesting, if not even strange, right? So she would serve jam to us, right? And if there was mold in the jam, she would take a spoon, scoop out the mold, throw the mold away, and then serve out of the rest of the thing. Or she would take cheese, and sometimes cheese would be in her refrigerator for a long time and it'd get mold on it. She'd cut off the mold and then serve the rest of the cheese. She would also save aluminum foil, and she made us put it in a ball, right? These aluminum foil balls. And, you know, one of the most interesting things was Ziploc bags. She would make us wash out Ziploc bags and reuse them so they could be reused. And so I thought my grandmother just had these strange habits until she died. And one of the things that I learned about her, and people telling stories about her, was I learned about her growing up during the Great Depression, right? That little piece of information, if I had been able to put that together while she was alive, I would have understood my grandmother so much more than the limited information that I had. And so context is everything. And so as you look at the person that gets talked about a lot, are there some things about context that may shed some light on why they behave or why those words are attributed to them out of the context? So would anyone like to talk about the person they chose and why? Yeah. No?
My dad was similar to my mother, and some of the words were, you know, hard worker, everyone depended on him, quiet, you know, he's that person that just really worked all the time. But until he grew up in depression, his father lost their farm in the depression and then died of tax stress. And so he had to raise at 19 his 6 brothers and sisters, and he was married and had a baby, and he was the sole provider at 19 for that big family.
I can see why work ethic might be important with 20-something, I mean, just a whole set of family systems, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Just, there was
At 19. Yeah, no choice.
girl, poor,
There was no choice.
but he never took it off, and he fixed everything himself. And all those things because, you know, I'm paid,
Yeah. Context. Other folks.
It's been another Great Depression. They killed in a lot of hardy souls and it's just a story. My grandma would have been the same time. She was born in 1913, but was clever and skilled and thrifty and kind of a community organizer. She was entrepreneurial and always trying to figure out how to make a little bit of money. Really, really loyal, but I would say they were all things that applied to her lifelong. I got some of her journals and like college stuff and scrapbooks in high school, and the notes that people wrote to her reflect the way that I thought of her in her 80s, 90s.
It's my sister, which I found the others were positive. The words I have for her: angry, absent, and hot mess. And that came on, I didn't know when I was a child, I was too young. And I would say in the 2000s.
think there might be some issues that are precipitating a response like that?
Ironically, I mean, I should have probably seen this before, but we created an aha moment for me, is that she never married, she always really wanted to, she's alone. When Aaron's died, she was truly alone. And it just, that's what it was, just that way.
Yeah, no.
And she was good.
I think it's important, and I think for that aha moment, because it really behooves us to really look at people. There's a couple of ways we can look at people. As if they're broken, and we'll ask the question, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you, right? What kind of response do you get from that kind of question?
Not a good one. You know.
Possibly not a good one, or one filled with excuses, filled with rationales, particular things we can't change, right? So there's that. But what happens if we ask the question, what happened to you? What has happened to you? Right? It's a totally different way of looking at folks, right? And so when we talk about the context, I am a firm believer that our context drives our behavior and all of our responses so much more than even our inherent, is it nature or nurture? I believe that it is context that drives both of those, right? And so people are responding, and here's the trick. If we go back to page 2. Right at the bottom of page 2, there are 4 things to know about human behavior. One is, I have a larger thing up on the things that don't. Yeah, you'll be okay. I have a larger one that you'll get a chance to look at. I didn't know it was going to be this small when I put it together, but humans can learn, change, and grow, right? So that's one of the first truths about human beings. We are not stagnant. We constantly are dynamic. We're developing. We're adapting. We're constantly doing all sorts of stuff. There will come a day when we lose a big toe because we're adapting, right? It's not as necessary as. Anyway, not a big toe, a pinky toe, I'm sorry. That big toe that balance is important, the pinky toe. Second is that people do what they think works even when what? Even when it doesn't. And they do that because it worked in the past. It was functional, it was something that helped them in the past, and they believe that this will help continue, which is why we have values, which is why we have paradigms that we have, because people thought that it was helpful, right? Yeah. And then next is that all human behavior is goal-directed, and it's goal-directed towards safety, significance, and belonging. And that lastly, all attitudes are goal-directed, right? And then, again, that goal-directedness is there. So when we look at people, we ask the question, what has happened to you? What we're asking is, how has the environment that you've been a part of shaped your behavior today? And is there anything you want to do about that? Right? And so having compassion for folks that I don't even know becomes a lot easier when I know that they're going after safety, significance, and belonging, and that there are things that have shaped their behavior. There are things that people do that I think is absolutely strange. But when I understand their context, the behavior makes sense to me. So there was an example, and an example of this was over at Brooklyn Center High School, right? So this was in the 90s, and there was a rash of toilets being ripped off the wall at Brooklyn Center High School. And when an administrator finds out about this kind of stuff, what is the first thing that they try to use as a method of changing behavior? Punishment, right? Punishment. So we're going to punish kids for this, right? If we catch you, we're going to punish you. And all this stuff. But the punishment wasn't stopping it from happening. So they had to come up with something else to try to figure out. And so they came up with this brilliant idea of like asking people why they were breaking the toilets off the wall, right? And when they found out the answer, they changed a lot of things about their policies. And this was the answer. The answer was that there were young people who had come from refugee camps. And in those refugee camps, you did not sit on the toilet, you squatted on the toilet. And so what was happening to these toilets at the high school?
They were just breaking up.
They were just breaking off because they weren't meant for that, right? Once they understood the context, then they could re-educate folks and say, okay, that's how it was at the refugee camp, but this is how it is here. Let's think about how to do that. So that punishment stuff that wasn't working got shifted into an education model that they could actually help people and start talking, and then recognizing that an immigrant experience and a refugee experience is a very different thing, right? And so once we understand where people are coming from, the context that they're coming from, we have a better understanding of them. And I would suggest that we come from a context too. And the more that we're able to understand the context that we come from, like it or not, we can understand ourselves better. Because what's in them is what's in us. All right? So let's do this. Let's take about a 5-minute break so people can go to the restrooms, walk around, and then we'll drive it home right after the break. Thank you. What do you? Which one is that?
This young woman was married before they came first, like, in the family.
Yeah.
Gets out this nice big hand, cuts this end off, and cuts that end off, and the husband says, "What's your hand off?" He goes, "That's good, Mom." Oh, just tell it to Mom, why did I cut the ends off my hand? Mom said, "Was that good grandma?" So we called her Grandma, why did you cut the ends off your hand? Oh, it had to fit my hand. No, it's like, context sometimes changes, and
Context-
we still do the same old thing.
The context always changes. Always.
So you gotta think about what we do.
I have to take a friend out here before I have to leave early. I don't want to leave it. Right, exactly.
We won't
I
judge
realized
you
it. I didn't have-
much.
I have to pick them up at 4:30 and I just did a little longer than I thought.
You have to finish your grant.
Just what I was.
So, is this stuff we can send so far?
I see how you're coming, you're gonna tell me.
Yes.
That's saving aluminum, but you're sure there's been some generations of, yeah, that story, is, I said aluminum. Not a roll in a ball, though. I just don't wait for it.
The thing that's really interesting is that many people don't want to be honest about that, but about the effects of the Great Depression, but there is no shortage of storage space.
No storage of storage,
There are always small storage places opening up all the time.
Oh, because people are, your husband are like, yeah,
But we don't get rid of stuff, we just
shift it.
shift it. And too often we shift it out of sight, which compels us to continue to.
something else I didn't do.
It's
I haven't used it within a year, and Africa, I was very clean, empty house. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I love that.
yeah.
Just this morning, I was telling my husband, you know that we have children. Why do you have children? I don't know why it's happening, but now I'm gonna use this gas, try to figure out why do I need so many children?
Because he doesn't have the best.
Well, Yes and no, but I think it's because he said we could have that much. But I always told him it's this is
I was waiting.
That's funny, Mike. Why the other thing didn't choose that? Maybe choose to, didn't say no.
Well, I guess they could. I hadn't thought about that. Some people can't stand. All right. So again, context is everything. And so context is about time, space, and place. Context is about time, space, and place. And what do we know about time, space, and place? It's constantly changing, right? It's constantly changing. So culture, a way that I like to define culture, is that culture is an adaptation to the context. That culture is an adaptation to the context. And as context changes, what also changes? So if culture is the adaptation to the context, and the context is always changing, what else is always changing? Culture, right? Culture is always changing and shifting. So, for people who don't like change, this is very bad news. Because even if you want change to stop or you want to be regressive, you can't stop change, right? Change has come to America. Anybody remember that? So this idea of going back again, I want to make America whatever again, is not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. So we need emerging technologies. We need new markets. We need all sorts of stuff as we move forward, because we're not, they will never be the same as they used to be. Right? Things will never be the same. So culture is an adaptation to context, and as context changes, so does culture. And context is important because the context for a carrot and the context for a cactus is very different, but the functions of both of those are very, very similar, right? So cactuses have roots. They branch up into the sunlight, so they use photosynthesis and blah, blah, blah. But given the nature of those environments, each plant requires different things, right? So because cactus is majority water, because it has to contain a lot of water, what does it what has it adapted to protect itself from being eliminated for its water source? The spines, right? The spines and the prickles, right? So that is a defense mechanism given the context that that is in because of how it's developed, right? So So dinosaurs are not here. Why? They could not adapt to the rapid change of the environment, right? So it is believed that a meteor came and boom, changed everything, and they couldn't adapt. So what do we do with people who call Brazil nuts by another name? Are people familiar with Brazil nuts? And the other name that they call that, right? So how do we deal with that?
I correct, but
Okay,
I'm
so
sure that's the best, I'm not sure that that's the best way. I'm just,
why are you not sure that that's the best way? Because that's what we say. We say if someone is ignorant, we need to educate them. And why are you not so sure that that's the best way?
I'm not sure you're listening. But my own reason,
Okay.
my fault.
No, you'd have to
My
out them.
well, no, I don't. My mother was Brazilian, so they were in our house all the time,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And so.
And it's actually not a nut, it's a seed. I don't know if anybody knew that. The Brazil nut is not really a nut, it's a seed.
2 points of that.
Yeah, 2 points. Yeah, that you know, and that might be the entry point to the second one, right? You're like, no, it's not a nut, it's a seed. You know. So the people that some people may know that call them by that, why do they call them that?
That was my question. Where did you learn that?
Yeah.
Why? Now I guess they come from Brazil and.
No, I mean, my mother would be appalled. I mean, my mother was
Oh,
appalled.
they're not from
But
Brazil.
no, it was probably from their parents.
Probably from their parents, right?
In fact,
Did they
know
make it
was-
up? The people that you know that, or people that people may know that called them that, did they make that up?
No.
No. Why did they call it that? Because that's what everybody was calling them, except for some people, right? I mean, so in the majority of culture, that's the kind of language that was used. If we hear someone saying that now, what do we say to those folks? Yeah, that's not what we say, right? And we try to correct them, or we may, love on them and say, hey, grandma, hey, that kind of stuff. And why do we do that? Why do we? We want to help them to adapt, right?
For me personally, I don't want it said as a child. I don't want him to carry on that generational thing that that's somehow okay saying whatever else.
Yep.
It's not. So if he doesn't see me staying, it's gonna happen.
Good.
So he's gonna think that that's me.
Yeah. So this is one thing I will, I think this is an interesting point, that, because when we have people in our lives that say inappropriate things, are purposefully, politically incorrect, and they know how we are, but they do those things, what do good people do? What do good people say? So you got a relative who's telling bad, racial, gender, xenophobic, homophobic jokes at a thing. What do good people typically say or do? I'm offended by it, stand up against it. I don't share your perspective. But if you know that Uncle Johnny's going to be at that event, and you've already mapped it out in your head, what often do good people say about going to that event?
I don't go.
I'm not going to go because Uncle Johnny's going to be there.
But I'm not sure that's right.
Right? Well, that's interesting, right? So, just a short story. I don't know if I told this story last time or not, but we did everything in the kitchen when I was a kid. So the kitchen was the meeting spot because that's where my mom was, right? So we wanted to be close to our mom and, whatever. And food. So, mom and food. And so I had a bad habit of leaving the ironing board in the kitchen. And because I ironed my clothes before I went to school and that kind of stuff, and I'd laid out the night before. Well, this particular night, it was a Thursday night, and my mom cooked catfish. And And so she cooked the catfish, and I didn't think anything of it. Next morning, Friday morning, I jump in my clothes, I iron my clothes, I jump in them, I head off to school. I'm in first hour algebra class, and I got a problem. I smell like catfish, right? Now, the interesting thing is, I had other clothes in the same house that didn't smell like catfish. And why do you think that was? Why did those clothes not smell like catfish? Because they weren't in close proximity to the catfish, right? So this is, I want to challenge you with this. So,
I have one more time.
yes.
And while you're in the room with the catfish, you get used to it and you don't see it and smell it and then realize it doesn't.
Absolutely correct. Yes. Right? So this is what I want to challenge you with. Because our tendency is to say, I don't want to be around those people, or those people can't be around my kids. Right? And there's two things to this. One is, after you laugh, I want you to just think about it though, right? So I smell like catfish because I was in close proximity to catfish, right? How many of you would consider yourself to be a good person? By your own standards, however you raise your hand if you consider yourself to be a good person, by your own standards, right? So I want you to think about this after you laugh. What do the people around you smell like? Do they smell good like you? So my relatives that are telling blue jokes or homophobic jokes or xenophobic jokes or just have these really off opinions, if there's two reasons, well, there's probably many reasons, but there are often two reasons why people choose not to be around them. One is they are afraid that that person actually might have a point. They're afraid that person might have a point. And secondly, they're afraid that they might be infected by that person's way of thinking. And here's the other kicker to this, right? And usually in those encounters where that person is there with either with our children or with ourselves, how long are people usually in the room with that particular person?
Less than 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes, right? In a very short amount of time because you're trying to avoid pain, right? You try to avoid pain. I find it interesting that people say I want to keep my kids out of that environment because they might catch a hold of that. I wonder how effective of a parent I think I am if 5 minutes of exposure will undo a lifetime of work. So we want us to think about that, challenge ourselves on that. Because our kids will be engaging folks like that, and so they need to know how to answer that stuff, and not run from it or avoid it, because that's what's gotten us here in the world we have today. So important stuff. So there's a couple of stuff that I wanted us to think about in terms of humans' adaptation to the context. So there's cultural knowledge, right? This idea of cultural knowledge is knowing the facts of a thing, right? So knowing about people's civil wars or when they get independence, the facts of a culture is cultural knowledge. Then there is cultural competence, which is understanding the balance between the artifacts and the values. That's how I like to define cultural competence, that I know what the values mean. Which also means, I know what the artifacts mean, which means I have to be in relationship with this culture to understand that dynamic, right? And then there is cultural humility, which is understanding that that my culture isn't primal. I'm not primary, rather. That the world doesn't evolve around me and my culture, but I actually can share space with other cultures. Then there's cultural engagement. There's cultural engagement, and we'll kind of talk about how we engage in cultural engagement and then cultural responsiveness. So one thing to think about in terms of cultural competence is these three words: people, process, and power. So if we want to have culturally competent organizations, they have to address or three ways to think about how to be culturally competent is understanding the people. So in terms of the people, who's at the table and who's not at the table, right? So who's a part of our organization and who's not a part of our organization, and what is the greater context as to why they're not a part of our organization, right? So here's an example, and I think I talked about this last time. 1954, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal doctrine. What did schools look like? Segregated. What does that mean? So black students went to one school and white students went to another, and who taught them? Same race teachers, right? What about administration? Same race, right? So we have black administration, white administration. We have black teachers, we have white teachers. We have black students, we have white students, right? Separate, but equal. Then in 1955, what happens? Brown versus the Board of Education overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that the separate but equal doctrine is not acceptable, right? So now we're on this journey to integration. Let's fast forward 25 years. We're 1970s. What do schools look like in the 70s? Integrated in some degree. So tell me, what degree? 1% degree? What degree?
Well, the busing started.
So busing's happening. So what do schools look like? Physically integrated and socially separated. So tell me what the schools look like, Courtney. What do schools look like?
Okay, give you an example. You have a classroom with students who are a mixture of races who go to the one school and you have white people in that.
Okay, so you have students in classrooms sitting side by side. You have black students and white students. And who's teaching them? White teachers. Who's the administration? White teachers, white men, right? So we integrated, but now what do people say about teachers of color? What have you heard people say about that? Now. Today, we don't have enough. We don't have enough teachers of color. We can't find any of them. Why can't we find them?
Because there's no pipeline.
We cut the pipeline, right? We cut the pipeline. So when we talk about this idea of people, why aren't those people on our boards? Where is our pipeline to have those people on our boards? Where's the pipeline to have those people be a part of our arts organization? Where's the pipeline to have a relationship with folks so they can understand our values and our artifacts? And if we've cut that off or we've never had one, how do we expect people to come into our organization? Right? Process, the same kind of concept. Process. What is our process? Are there artificial barriers to participation in our organizations, right? And artificial barriers are designed to benefit us, never the clients, never the customers, never the consumers. And we'll talk about bureaucracies in just a second. And then power. And I like this idea of power, but I also would use as a caveat that when I talk about power, I'm actually talking about the ability to participate, right? So the power in its dictionary definition is the ability to do work, right? So what is the ability of people to participate in my organization, right? In decision making, in budget setting, in priority making, setting the vision. How do people participate using power in my organization? And here are a couple of 4 ways that you can think about these and do a self-assessment of your own organization. People, processes, and power. Is your organization homogeneous or heterogeneous? Right? Is it made of people who look like everybody else that's there? And I said this joke the other day. I was at, I remember going to an NPR party. Went to an NPR party, had a friend that worked there, and they were doing some diversity efforts, and they were excelling at these diversity efforts. But the funny thing was, they had different races of people who looked exactly the same. Right? So they had, so anyway, that was probably a bad joke. But so homogeneous or heterogeneous? Are we trying to be, are we trying to capitalize on all the diversity that is around us? Are we monocultural or intercultural? We'll spend a little more time talking about those concepts in just a second. But are we of one culture? Are we trying to just say, this is how we do things, this is the culture of our organization, get aboard this or get off the bus? Or are we saying there are a number of ways in which we interact to reach the mission of the organization, and bring some of your stuff and let's see how we can make all this stuff work together? Are we proactive or reactive? Are we going out in terms of looking at people? Are we going out looking for ways to partner with other organizations or with groups of people? Or are we waiting for them to come? Do we just send out an email or a mailing and say, come diverse people to our thing, and that's the extent of the work that we did, right? And then lastly, are we divesting or are we investing in folks? Are we constantly drawing from communities of color and saying, communities of color, we need your help with our thing? Or are we in a relationship where we can say, as a community of color, we've got some things we can offer you, and you have some things you can offer us. It's just a mutually beneficial relationship, as opposed to just divesting people of their talent and time and resources. Any questions about this idea of cultural competence? I don't think it's in your handout, but I'll give you the access to it. Cool. No questions? We'll move on. All right. Oh, you were taking a picture.
I did,
Sorry.
I got it. It's just nicely put. We talk about that a lot. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, go back to that side.
Oh, okay.
One of the things you mentioned before that I think is really true, that I hadn't thought of it this way, is that cultural competence requires that you're in a relationship so that you can actually use your skills.
Yes.
Versus cultural knowledge, where
Yes.
you learned about something but you really haven't interacted. So I just hadn't thought about it in that term before, but I like that analogy that to be competent, you have to interact, you have some interaction and relationship, or it's knowledge.
Right.
It's knowledge until you have some chance to practice it.
Yeah.
You're doing good work.
Feeling good. There's just a couple of slides to talk about kind of the socialization process. Many of us kind of understand that, so we won't spend a whole lot of time with that. But just know that if we're not careful, we just pass on what was passed to us. And let's skip that stuff. So, let me see, where am I? So let's go over to page 10. No, not page 10. Go to page 6 before I get to these. So there's this idea of the proactive, homogeneous, democratic, autocratic, powerful, bureaucratic, and I talked about being bureaucratic or being a bureaucracy. What does that mean? What is a bureaucracy?
Hierarchy of power.
Hierarchy of power. Okay. What else? It's hoops to jump through.
Something that's not fluid, it's very structured and
Very structured and unbending.
That's the way we do things.
It's the way you do
Yeah.
things. Okay.
Pretty process, not people.
Very process driven, not people orientated. Can somebody look it up for me? Can you look up either bureaucratic or bureaucracy or bureaucrat? Bureaucrat, bureaucracy, or bureaucratic?
bureaucracy of a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than by elected representatives.
All right, so a system of government where elected officials are not making the decision, but employees are, all right? So what is a bureaucrat?
Yeah. An official in the government department in particular one procedure is concerned with the procedure correctness of the particular matter.
Bureaucrat. And bureaucratic is the process of doing that, right? So we've often, did I put the picture in here? Because, oh yeah, it's on the back. So turn to the back on page 12. Because this is where people get stuff confused, right? So on those pictures, the first one is equality, right? So we have diversity there. Do we have diversity there? In that first picture on the back of your handout, page 12, that very first panel of that picture, do we have diversity there?
Yes.
Yes, we have diversity there, right? So everybody is not the same, so we have diversity, right? And part of the concern then is, so we have diversity and we have equality, meaning what? Everybody's getting the same thing, right? So we have diversity and we have equality. The second panel, we have what? We have equity, which is what? Focusing on the same outcome for everyone? Yes, and sort of. So in the first panel, everybody's getting the same thing. Is that fair or unfair?
People don't have the same results. They don't have the same opportunities to see the game because they're not outfitted yet.
Okay, so they're not
Where they're
outfit.
coming.
But am I providing the same resources to everybody? It is fair. It's fair. Right?
Okay.
No, you're right. I'm disagreeing with you for a point, but you're right. You are right. You are correct. So I want to affirm you in that. So the second panel, which we call equity, by its nature is unfair. If the first is considered to be fair, the second one would be considered unfair. Right? Why? Because I'm giving preferential treatment. That's the language that people like to use around that stuff, right? I'm not saying that's what I believe, but that's what people like to use.
You're giving more resources to one.
So I could be giving more resources to one group. Now, I hope if you can see that progression, then the third picture should offer you something so radical that if we're just looking at those first two pictures, we'll never see the third picture. And what does the third picture offer us in terms of this idea of inclusion?
And you can do who you want without alternates.
The problem never was the people.
Yeah.
And so in trying to make things equal, we were trying to say that the people in some way were defective. And trying to make equity, we were trying, again, saying the people were defective, when in fact it was the structures. So this is the thing about inclusion that people get wrong. They think we have to do something extra, when in fact we have to actually do less. We've got to look at our policies and procedures and say, why are we here's an example. Anyone work with actors? Right? Okay, so can actors create different personas? Yeah, hopefully, right? I mean, that's the craft, right? And what do we call that? I will say though that after you get a certain level of fame and success, all the movies, like Will Smith is Will Smith in all of his movies. You know, Tom Cruise is Tom. You know. But for the struggling actors who haven't gotten there, we got to take on different personas. Is that acting a skill?
Yes.
Yes, it is a skill. Which means what? It can be learned. You can learn how to act like that, right? So Tyra Banks on America's Next Top Model is training models how to be Tyra Banks, right? So you can learn that skill. Why do we interview? You ever thought about that? Why do we do interviews for jobs? Find the right person for the job. How do you know? Brad Pitt acted like a doctor in, what was that, Zombie Z? What was the movie that he did with the zombies? Z Nation, Z something about zombie. He acted like a doctor who could cure zombies. Can Brad Pitt cure zombies? Right? So here, just an interesting question for us to think about. Does how I show up in an interview directly relate to how I show up on the job?
Not necessarily.
Is there a direct correlation to that? So why do we interview?
I think sometimes it does. I try to be consistent. I may not have had my feet out.
Yeah. I would suggest that the type of interview makes those correlations happen, right? So if I'm doing for example, anyone can develop the skill of learning how to talk in doing something. But there are some people who aren't good at talking, but that's not what the job requires. It requires them to do something. So if I had an interview and I'm looking for a set designer, and I got some hammer and nails, and I said, make me something using that thing, that's a direct correlation to that. But if I just sit them down and say, tell me about yourself, what was your childhood like? And no. That might be way out of his realm, and how's he going to score? He's not going to score as effective as somebody who's mastered that skill, but may not even know how to do what's required, right? So when we look at that idea of inclusion, what are the barriers to participation that we need to look at? I'm not saying, and I'm not an anarchist. I just want to say that. I'm not an anarchist. I believe that there are structures that need to be in place, that there are things that, we need to police. We need them. We need them to act better, but we need them, right? So, but in our organizations, when we think about this idea of cultural competence and we think about participation, blah, 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 do we have bureaucratic barriers that prevent people from having access? And do we have pipeline relationships that are mutually beneficial to building those constituents in our organizations? So I want to touch on that. If we flip back to page 6 just for a second. Actually, let's go all the way back to 4. I'm sorry. So on page 4, I found this article, and apparently, and I love my Nigerian brothers and sisters. They are so resourceful, just absolutely resourceful. So if you read that caption, when we talk about artifacts, read that caption, there are Nigerian hair salons all over China where many Chinese go to get their hair kinky is becoming very popular in China. Who knew, right? So here are these Chinese getting afros, right? So this idea of cultural competence also recognizes what is cultural competence, what it means to be cultural competence, is to understand appropriation and misappropriation, right? So appropriation means that cultures always will mix and always will borrow things from each other, right? So I like lefse. I'm not appropriating it. I'm not misappropriating it. I just like it, right? So lefse is cool, because I'm able to put it in its context. I'm able to relate the context to. I know that lefse comes from Scandinavian countries and blah 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 blah. So I'm using it, but I'm not using it outside of context, right? Misappropriation is when we take an artifact and we use it outside of its original context, or we don't understand the context, or we don't care about the context, right? So at that World Market, and they had a package of henna that you could buy to decorate your hand, the henna and the art, and it had a white woman's face on it, and I was like, cultural appropriation, misappropriation, right? So there's that. I'm going to go back to page 6 now, thank you. And just kind of talk about the intercultural development continuum, or this is the tool that, or the model that the IDI uses. Is anyone familiar with the IDI? Intercultural Development Inventory. And so they move from this idea of denial, which is on the monocultural side, to this idea of adaptation, which is on the intercultural mindset side. And so denial is saying that there is no difference, and denial happens in two ways. One is there is no difference, or those kind of differences don't matter. Polarized means that we're kind of in this dual way of being frozen in our thought patterns about other cultures. Minimizing is saying, let's reduce how we look at our differences. Our differences don't matter that much. Let's look at the universalness of human experience. And then acceptance is the recognition of the dynamics of commonalities and differences. And then acceptance, and adaptation is then, how do we take all of that into our environment and move the organization forward? So that's an intercultural model to think about. Melanie?
I have a question. When you're thinking about minimizing the differences, how do you think about that with your common drivers of safety, belonging, and unity? Because I do think those are really universal common drivers among all people. It doesn't mean we all have the same values, but I think that can get a little confusing.
It can be a little bit confusing. What I would suggest is it's the actual act of trying to say, I want to raise one higher than the other, right? So,
or that minimization, I thought, is we're all the same, and we're all kind of like colorblind.
Yeah, so but colorblind, I mean, yeah, it's that kind of thing, but colorblindness says, I'm not going to look at race. Let's press back, let's minimize that and exalt this other thing, right? So it's that process of trying to minimize one thing and exalt something else, right? We don't have a gender problem. Everybody knows that men are the best, so it's that process. When in fact, I think it's this process. We are very much alike, and we are very much different. So let's talk about that, right? As opposed to trying to raise or reduce one or the other. Cool. So let's go to page 7. On page 7, scroll down. So culture is a group of people's adaptation to the context. As the context changes, so must culture. At the top of page 7, I'll give you a copy of the handouts because it's way smaller on your handout than it is on mine. There's some written commentary on it, on the monocultural and the intercultural cultures, what the findings are for those. That come straight out of IDI. And so, so there's that. We talked earlier about this idea of surface culture is the stuff you can see, and the deep culture is the stuff that you can't see. There's also another model that I like to use from Mitchell Hammer that talks about how to look at cultures in a couple of other different ways, right? So one axis is that cultures are expressive or reserved, right? So they're very emotional, or they hold back information, right? So there's direct, indirect, there's a discussion style of engagement, and then there is engagement, there's accommodating and dynamic, there's high context cultures and low context cultures. And on page 7, you can see the graphs that kind of talk about those cultures. Next to the carrot, you'll see, actually I did it in color, so it didn't come out as good for you, but I'll send it to you in color. You can see areas of the world that, so in the United States, do you think, are we emotionally restrained as a dominant society? Yeah, we're emotionally restrained, right? And are we indirect or are we pretty direct?
It depends on where you are.
Yeah, depends on where you are.
Indirect in the Midwest, direct on the coast.
Okay, so direct on the coast. I would even say in terms of, so we have Minnesota Nice here, which is a soft coat over some other stuff, but we're still pretty direct, right? So if we have a contract for something, even if I'm from Minnesota, what do I say? We got a contract and you've breached the contract, what do I say? Yeah, fix it straight up. No, I may try to say it nice, but I'm like, we got a contract, right? In other cultures, even if there was a contract, there was a breach, they would send an emissary to say, can we fix this? How do we work with that? How do we blah, 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 blah. So what's interesting about that is that in the Middle East, people are typically more emotionally expressive and direct, right? So we get this dynamic style that is directly opposed to how Western thought operates, which creates these kind of culture clashes. This is demonstrations of that all over the world. We turn over to page 9. Oh, I had it up here. So we'll go to page 9 in just a second. I'll go back over this. So this discussion style, which is direct and emotionally restrained, there's a lot of kind of Western cultures that are in this, right? So North American, Europe, Asian Pacific, so Australia, New Zealand, all kind of Western cultures are very direct and emotionally restrained, right? Don't show your emotions in negotiations, don't smile, all that kind of stuff. In the accommodation style, there is emotionally restrained and indirect. And so that'll be American Indians, Latin American folks, Asian folks would be this kind of indirect and emotionally restrained. And then engagement, so very direct and emotionally expressive. African Americans, Greece, France, Italy, and Spain, Central and Latin America, and the Middle East. And then dynamic, which is emotionally expressive, and indirect, which means that they use kind of mediators to broker deals. Are places in the Middle East like Egypt and Saudi, and it's funny, Pakistan is in Asia, but it's also considered in the Middle East as well, right? So, so when we talk about conflicts, global kind of conflicts, what we'll see is we have this dynamic and this discussion style that's oftentimes in conflict with one another, based on how they use information, decide to share information. I would also say that the way Mitchell Hammer talks about this is in terms of conflict, but if you substitute the word conflict for communication, you also see these very same kinds of ways that people interact with one another. So here are a couple of other cultural concepts to take in and understand, and that's high context culture and then low context culture. So when you look at this particular picture, at this top picture, we think about high context culture. High context culture is about trust, it's about relationship, it's relationship focused, it's about the group. What is happening in this picture if we look at it from a high context point of view? Okay, so let's think about this idea. So high context is about trust, it's relationship focused, and it's about the group. So what's most important in this school of fish? What's that?
Arts and culture.
Arts and culture?
Variation in size and color, together
They are
a school of
the
fish.
school of fish. And this is what? The outcast.
Oh.
So high context culture is about the group. So this is the outcast. But in low context culture, where it's very legalistic, that is very activity focused, it's very individual, what is this fish? He's the leader. Right? He's the leader of all these fish. He's the leader in a low context culture. And so oftentimes if we don't understand the relationship or the dynamic of the people that we're working with, we'll think that somebody is the, well, we want to know who is the Somali leader in this organization. And the person says, I am, but nobody else says that person is, then he's an outcast, right? So your whole thing could be undermined by not knowing the difference between those. So that's important. So again, we talked a little bit about low context and high context culture. So Germans and Scandinavians, more low context cultures. Japanese and Chinese, more higher context cultures, right? So kind of this east versus west, or what east and west on a spectrum. Which I just think is some good information to know. We talked a little bit about those mindsets. So monocultural mindsets make sense of cultural differences and commonalities based on one's own values and practices. So that's mono, so I'm the judge of those things. Use broad stereotypes to identify cultural difference. Supports less complex perceptions and experiences of cultural differences and commonality, where intercultural or global mindsets make sense of cultural differences and commonalities based on one's own and others' culture's values and practices. Uses cultural generalizations to recognize cultural difference, so takes those nuances into account. And then lastly, supports more complex perceptions of experience of cultural difference and commonalities. So this idea of being interculture is a much more sophisticated way of thinking about cultures, which also takes what? Things that are more complex also take a bit more what? Work and time and energy, right? And a lot of people don't want to don't have the willingness oftentimes to put those things into action to make intercultural spaces work. What's that? And mistakes. Yep, and mistakes. Kind of talked about that. This is one of the last things that I'll leave you with. Got 3 more to go. So, in terms of being culturally competent, it's important for us to recognize that. So there's some words that we've misused, right? So this idea of bigotry. What typically have people? How have they talked about the concept of bigotry? What is bigotry? They're small-minded, exclusive, and presumptive, judgmental, self-centered. And when you tell people that they are those things, they say thank you. No, they typically don't, right? What I'd like to offer you is that we have to think about this idea of bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination in very different ways. And I like to use this model that comes out of cognitive behavior therapy. And it says that behavior impacts thoughts, thoughts impact feelings, feelings impact behaviors. And this keeps going. This whole circle keeps going. And so if I have a behavior that I want to get changed, what are the 2 things that I need to consider in terms of making sure that I'm able to change that behavior? Feelings and thoughts, right? So discrimination is a behavior that we want to eradicate. 1964 was supposed to be done with the Civil Rights Act, right? It was supposed to be done, but it's not. Why? Because we have to look at bigotry and prejudice rightly. So if discrimination is a behavior, bigotry then becomes what? An emotion. Now, the interesting thing about emotions is that emotions cannot be educated. Right? Have you ever had a sad friend who had the blues? Right? Can you imagine going to that sad friend and giving them a PowerPoint presentation of all the reasons that they should be happy? How would that go over? Not very well at all, right? So bigotry as an emotional state. So to get that friend to be happy, what do you do with that friend to bring them joy, to get them out of that blues state? You do something. You go get ice cream. You sit and talk. You go for a walk. You go volunteer at Feed My Starving Children, or you do something, right? So when it comes to bigotry, we have to recognize that bigotry is an emotional state, and there's only, and I would say that love is the best way to get rid of bigotry. Compassion, empathy is the best way to get rid of bigotry. Prejudice is a frozen mindset, and how do you thaw a frozen mindset? You ask questions. And the more questions you ask, the more their mindset thaws. Your objective is not to change their mind, but to thaw their thinking, right? So, Dad, you heard that on that news station. Are there other news stations that might say something different? Well, I don't know. Well, let's look at that. What book did you get those statistics that you're quoting? What book did you get that from? And is there another book that might say something different? Well, I don't know. Now you're starting to get people thawed in their thinking just by asking questions. And not smart alecky questions, but authentic, knowledge-seeking questions. And what you'll also find is once you start melting their thought process, they may go backwards into this bigotry thing and say, well, I don't know, this is just how I feel. And then you can also engage them with the second set of weapons, which is empathy, which is understanding, which is love. Because those things, because emotions plus thoughts dictate behaviors. So if we want to get these behaviors under control, if we want organizations that are culturally competent, we have to recognize how to deal with those things. And lastly, I don't teach my daughter about diversity stuff. It's what I do. It's what she will do one day. But I don't teach her about it. I show her. So if we want culturally competent organizations, we can't just talk about it. We have to demonstrate it in everything that we do, from our hiring practices to our postings. And we also have to make sure that our white brothers and sisters don't feel alienated by these advances that we're trying to make sure that everyone has access. And so we do that by addressing those things. We don't run from them. We don't hide from them. Because we understand what people want. All people want safety, significance, and belonging. They just don't want it the same way. My name is Andre Koen. Thank you so much for your time. Well, any questions, comments, observations? It is 4 o'clock, so.
Great things that we went over.
Good. Yes, I will.
You need
I
an
will.
email or let me know?
Yeah, I'll get them from, if you've read